Imagine for a moment that you're told that being kind is not always best. Would that surprise you? Kindness, that virtue, we all value that characteristic that leads us to help each other and build a better world. Can it have a dark side for Niccolò Machiavelli? Yes, it does. And what's even more disturbing is that kindness, as we understand it, could be one of the main reasons why power slips through our hands. Remember to subscribe, turn on notifications, and enjoy philosophy. In The Prince, Machiavelli presents an uncomfortable truth. Politics is not about being good, but about being effective. Kindness, in its purest form, can be an obstacle in the pursuit of power. And if we think about history, we cannot help but see how those who have been considered good in traditional terms have often been the most vulnerable. In politics, kindness can be seen as weakness because being good doesn't necessarily make you strong. You might become an easy target, someone whom others can manipulate or overthrow. And what about the morality of kindness? Machiavelli challenges the concept that one must be virtuous at all costs. Morality, as we've been taught, is not always compatible with survival or success. On the contrary, the morality imposed by society is often designed to keep people under control, to make them submit to the system. And in this context, being good means accepting a series of rules and expectations that don't necessarily benefit the individual. For a ruler, kindness shouldn't be a goal but a means to maintain power. Machiavelli even points out that the prince must be willing to act ruthlessly when the situation requires it, even if that means getting his hands dirty or losing his reputation for being virtuous. Thus, the dark side of kindness that MO2 describes is not in kindness itself, but in how attachment to that kindness can blind us to the realities of power. The ideal prince, according to Machiavelli, should not be completely bad or completely good. In fact, he must be able to adapt to the situation, to be flexible, to know when to use virtue and when it is necessary to resort to cunning or force. In other words, Machiavelli doesn't despise kindness, but he does warn about the dangers of being exclusively good when what's at stake is stability and power. Machiavelli tells us that politics is a field where truth and morality don't always align. In fact, one of the darkest concepts he raises is that in many cases it's more effective to be feared than loved. Kindness, if taken to the extreme, can make others lose respect for you. This doesn't mean that the ruler should be cruel without reason, but that he must be aware that political life is not always a fair game. The moment a prince acts only out of kindness, he becomes vulnerable, and that vulnerability is exploited by those who seek his downfall. Misunderstood kindness can even lead to the failure of a reign. In this sense, Machiavelli invites us to reflect on what it means to be a good ruler. According to him, the appearance of kindness can be useful, but the true virtue of a ruler is the ability to make difficult decisions when the situation demands it. Ethics and principles of kindness are not always viable. When in power, toughness and pragmatism are essential to maintain control and ensure survival. Machiavelli is clear: being good and just will not always lead you to power, but being astute and adaptable will give you the tools to achieve it. This vision may be disheartening, even dangerous, but also very realistic if we observe history. It is here where the paradox of kindness becomes even more evident. Those who have been considered good rulers in historical terms, such as Alexander the Great or Caesar, were not always the most virtuous. In fact, many of them employed ruthless tactics to consolidate their power. And despite criticisms of their methods, the fact is that they were great leaders. History is full of figures who, although not morally perfect, left a legacy that endured. Ultimately, the key to their success was understanding when to act with toughness, when to show vulnerability, and when to apply kindness as a strategy to achieve their goals. Machiavelli's true lesson about kindness lies in his ability to analyze human nature and power dynamics. Kindness, as understood in traditional morality, is a quality that is presumed to be absolute and admirable, but Machiavelli challenges us to look beyond that idealistic perspective and to face the reality that in the world of power, virtues are just tools. Morality is subject to circumstances, and it is adaptability that, according to him, defines a leader capable of staying at the top. Looking at the great leaders of history, we can see how some aligned with what is expected of a kind ruler, but others understood that true power lies in doing what is necessary to preserve order and ability. Political decisions, according to Machiavelli, must be made without the pressure of conventional morality. Politics is not about being good or bad, but about how power relationships are managed, how the weaknesses of the enemy are perceived, and how cunning is used to advance. And it is here where we can understand one of the most famous phrases from the prince: the end justifies the means. This idea is not a praise of cruelty without reason, but an observation that in extreme situations, decisions must be pragmatic. Kindness should not be a prison, should not be a barrier that prevents us from making the difficult decisions needed to preserve power and stability in the political context. Morality is flexible, and kindness, if not handled properly, becomes a fatal weakness. What Machiavelli shows us is that kindness is more effective when it is understood as a tool of power, not as an end in itself. The ruler who sees himself as a morally perfect being is doomed to frustration because the world is not a place where one can always do the right thing. At least, according to traditional norms, sometimes kindness has to yield to the need to make difficult decisions to ensure the safety, well being, and future of a community. It is in those moments when the ruler has to act firmly that the true nature of power is revealed. Take, for example, the case of a leader who must take harsh measures to protect his people from an external threat. Is it morally right to do so? The answer, according to Machiavelli, does not depend on whether those measures align with traditional morality, but on whether they manage to maintain order and stability. The ruler who finds himself trapped in the expectations of traditional kindness may miss the opportunity to act effectively in the end. Morality is not always practical, and kindness is not always the way to go. However, this does not mean that Machiavelli completely despises kindness. What he proposes is a more complex and nuanced vision. Kindness must be managed with intelligence and strategically. Kindness should be a quality that is shown when it is useful, but must also yield when the context demands it. A leader must have the wisdom to know when to be compassionate and when to be firm. Kindness should be a tactical virtue, not a rigid moral that limits us. This is where Machiavelli delves even deeper into human nature, recognizing that kindness and morality are ultimately social constructs that should not be taken as absolute truth. What he proposes is that the ruler must be astute enough to manage the perception that others have of him, using virtues as instruments of manipulation. The perception of kindness is often more important than true kindness itself. At the end of the day, what really matters is stability and control. And this cannot always be achieved by being good kindness. Like everything has its place, but it cannot be the compass that guides all the actions of a leader. The ruler must be a master of public image, knowing when to appear virtuous and when to resort to more enduring methods. This flexibility will allow him not only to survive in the game of power, but to thrive in it. Machiavelli is not speaking out against kindness as a moral value, but rather is challenging the notion that kindness as we know it should be the main motivation behind political decisions. Morality and politics should be a strategy, not an absolute moral that is imposed regardless of circumstances. If a leader is too rigid in his kindness, he could lose the opportunity to maintain the power and well being of his people. It is that flexibility that allows great rulers like Caesar or Alexander the Great to leave a lasting legacy. They knew when to be good and when to be cunning. The fascinating thing about Machiavelli's perspective is that his view of kindness is not as condemnation of morality, but a critique of how often morality can become a prison. Kindness should not be a blind obligation, it should be something that is used strategically to achieve what is necessary to accomplish greater goals. In some way, Machiavelli invites us to rethink our relationship with morality and with kindness itself, to understand that these concepts should not be absolute or subject to rigid norms. Take the example of the great rulers of history. Were they all good according to traditional moral parameters? The answer is no. Some were cruel, others pragmatic. Some acted ruthlessly, but all of them achieved what they set out to do because they knew how to manage the perception of the kindness, using it as a means to maintain power. It is in that flexibility where the true power of a leader resides. Machiavelli reminds us that politics is not a terrain where conventional moral norms always apply, and that in many cases, kindness must yield to the need to make difficult decisions. Thus, kindness becomes a tool, not an end. A prince must be able to recognize when kindness must yield to harshness, when cunning must replace moral purity. In this sense, the Machiavellian vision is both a critique of idealistic conceptions of morality and a warning. In the game of power. True skill lies in knowing how to manage morality in your favor, not simply following it blindly. It is difficult to ignore that. For Machiavelli, power and morality do not always go hand in hand. If we follow his reasoning, what is at stake is not whether a leader's actions are good or bad in the conventional sense, but whether those actions lead to stability, prosperity, and maintenance of power. The dilemma he presents is a brutal reminder of the pragmatic nature of politics. Traditional morality does not always have a place in decisions that require speed, effectiveness, and above all, survival. Machiavelli does not reject kindness but sees it as a means, and as such, it must be used with cunning. The deepest lesson that can be drawn